Welcome everyone to our fifth class in this particular series of going through this section of the S'dei Chemed, which is the halakhic encyclopedia, and we're in volume 8 of the standard Lubavitch printed S'dei Chemed. Page that we're on right now is Aleph Taf Reish Ches, which would be 100608, which is opposite page 3214. So it would be 3215. And we're in the section, we're in Siman Vav, which speaks about Goy. And right now, we are in the middle of a very lengthy and very detailed, and it seems sometimes repetitive because of the different opinions that he's quoting everybody, with regards to shi'urim, measurements for Bnei Noach. That for Jewish people, measurements play a very important role in Jewish law. When it comes to fulfilling a required precept, a mitzvah, or when it comes to transgressing, whether it's eating, whether it's age, different things where measurements play in. And as I mentioned in a previous class, more than you can even imagine. Extremely meticulous, extremely specific when it comes to so many mitzvahs, whether it's weight, whether it's volume, whether it's size, whether it's distance, measurements. Question is, when the Torah, when God is speaking to the non-Jew with regards to his responsibility, his mitzvahs, the prohibitions for him, do measurements play a role or not? So, in towards the end of the previous class, just to remind you, we were discussing the story in Bereshis and Genesis, where the two sons of Jacob, Shimon and Levi, wiped out an entire city, for they had committed a crime of kidnapping, which is forbidden for Bnei Noach. It's stealing. And that Shechem kidnapped Dinah, their sister. And they played a trick on the entire city. They were a bit deceitful in order to accomplish their mission. And they got the entire city, everybody in one day, to circumcise themselves. Everybody is all weak. Everybody is lying there right after they just had this circumcision, especially in the olden days. They didn't have the same types of anesthesia or whatever that we have nowadays. So they're all lying there in tremendous pain. Shimon and Levi, these two young men, came and they killed out all of the entire city, all of Shechem. The question is, one person committed a terrible crime. True. Why did they kill the whole city? So the way that the Rambam explains this is because another one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach is establishing courts of law. They failed to do this. In other words, everybody else in the town was responsible to bring this individual to justice. Apparently, they didn't have such a system. Therefore, everyone who is a responsible adult is a transgressor of that particular mitzvah of the 7 Ochet commandments, and we know that every one of the 7 is a capital offense, thus they all had to be killed. Question becomes, what age exactly? And we know that they didn't kill the children, for the verse states clearly that they took the women and the children as captives, together with all the loot, the booty that they took, etc. So how do we define children? We know that in the Jewish religion, it's very clear. For a boy, it's age 13 manhood. And then we even got into it last time, which we're going to get into again today. It's not really, as many people mistakenly think, that it's the 13th birthday and that's it. He actually has to have physical maturity as well, and he has to have 2 pubic hairs after he turns 13. If he's still 12 and he has those, what we call simanim, those signs of maturity of adulthood, doesn't count. It's only that we see that he has those 2 hairs after he turned 13. All right, fine. That's an adult. Before that, he is a minor, and basically, at least biblically, he is pretty much equal to a newborn infant that has no responsibilities and doesn't understand, that has no knowledge, etc. It's not exactly like that because it's a concept of education, but as far as being held accountable and responsible and punishable, a boy who's 12 and a half years old, same as a newborn baby. But the question is, by Bnei Noach, obviously you can't hold responsible and punish an infant, as we see that they did leave the children. The question is, what's called a child? So is it age 13? That means that there is a specific age as it is by the Jews. And the argument that we're making all along over here, for the most part, we're going back and forth, for the most part is that there are no shiurim, there are no set measurements for non-Jews, for the Bnei Noach. And it's a special, all the shiurim are oral tradition given by God to Moshe, to Moses. And it's only for the Jew, including the age of adulthood. So how does that work for Bnei Noach? So what we suggested last time over here, we brought down that each individual has to be judged on his own individual merits. Unlike by the Jew, that as long as you see that he has the age and he has the physical maturity, that's it. You don't have to test his knowledge and his intellectual maturity, as long as he's not in the category of a shoite, which is the legal term for someone who is legally, by Jewish law, biblically, insane, deranged, but really not just mentally challenged. That's a whole different discussion, but he's really literally insane, mad. As long as he's not that, doesn't matter what his IQ is, he's age 13, he has the pubic hairs, he's an adult, responsible adult. What do we do by Bnei Noach? So each person has to be judged, which parenthetically we said that's kind of hard to understand practically in the case of Shem. What did they do over there? Each individual person from roughly age 8 through 16 or 15 or whatever, they had to, test the person and see where he's up to or how to, Anyway, that's where we're at. Okay, we're now currently in the bottom of the right-hand column. The first word of the paragraph is the big word oid. Furthermore. Again, page Aleph Taf Reish Ches, bottom of the right-hand column. Oid heivi b'chasam soifer, simen shin yud zayin b'dibur maschil v'haloim. Last time, we quoted the Chasam Sofer, who we mentioned, lived close to 200 years ago, and he was one of the greatest rabbis of his time, and to this day, we rely on him to a very great deal when it comes to Jewish law. He has a series of responsa. So, in his book, which he calls Chasam Sofer, he brings as follows. Mashihiksha Rav Echad b'Sefer Tshuva Me'ahava Chelik Gimel b'Kuntras Hataruv v'Siman Taf Lamed Beis. So he says a particular rabbi, and he gives the name of the book and exactly where it's to be found over there, asked the following question. Misoif Nazir, from the end of tractate Nazir. It's one of the tractates of the Talmud, the Nazarite, which is basically an individual who voluntarily takes upon himself a very particular type of a vow, and by just saying that, behold, I am a Nazir, by just saying those words, he then immediately becomes forbidden to have anything to do with drinking any type of wine, grape juice, eating grapes, raisins, anything of that nature. He's not allowed to become defiled from a dead body. He cannot come in contact with any dead body, including immediate relatives, where normally one would be allowed to, like a kohen, a priest. And the third thing is he's not allowed to cut his hair at all or trim it whatsoever, as long as he's a Nazirite. And then when he concludes it, when he finishes being a Nazirite, he then has to bring particular sacrifices. He has to shave off his hair completely, and he has to bring certain sacrifices in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple. So at the end of the tractate of Nazir, the Mima'atinon Nachri Mufla Samuch Leish Me'erchin Unedarim. There, the Talmud has a specific teaching to exclude the non-Jew from what's called Mufla Samuch Leish. Let me explain briefly. When it comes to any type of a vow in Torah law for a Jew, so normally, anything that a Jew says, in order for it to have any effect, to be binding, to do anything for good or for bad, he's got to be a responsible adult. The girl has to be 12, the boy has to be 13. Anything they say under that age is meaningless. Again, for educational purposes, we may punish them or admonish them or make them keep their word, whatever it may be. But that's just for educational purposes. Let's say we're speaking about consecrating something to the Holy Temple. A child under age 13, his words are meaningless. Besides the fact that he can't really own anything, so he doesn't have anything to consecrate, it's not his, it's really his father's. But putting that aside, if a child would to make a vow, it means nothing. However, this is actually one exception in the whole Torah, and it really is, I don't know if I can use the word surprising, but it's surely an exception, and it is wondrous. I don't want to say bewildering, but it's different, it's wondrous. And that is, as an exception, a Jew, a Jewish male, between age 12 and 13, the year before he becomes an adult, only when it comes to verbal vows and the like, his word might actually be binding biblically. It depends. We need to test him and see if he understands the meaning and the ramifications of what he said. If he does, then it's binding biblically as if he's an adult. Very different than everything else in the Torah. He's not 13. He doesn't have the pubic hairs. He is clearly a minor. Between age 12 and 13, his vows might count. We have to test him each time he makes a vow. Even if when he turned 12, he made a vow, we tested him, and he was intellectually mature enough and he understood the situation. If a month later he makes another vow, we have to test him again. And even if the day before he turns 13, he makes a vow, we have to test him again. All right. Now, what about the non-Jew? So, the Talmud in Nazir derives that when it comes to the Nachri, the non-Jew, we exclude him from this type of ruling, from this category of 1 year prior. But what do we see from that? The fact that the Talmud excludes the non-Jew and says it's not applicable to him, Harei, behold, sheyesh shiurim halal leben noyach. That means that we do have these measurements. We do have a particular age. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't make any sense. Why you have to exclude him? I wouldn't even know how to include him in the first place. There's no such thing as the age of adulthood across the board. We said everybody is his own individual has to be tested. For one person, it might be age 18. For another person, it might be 21. For another person, it might be age 8. So what do you mean we exclude him that the year prior to his adulthood? From that, we seem to see that there are shiurim generally for the non-Jew. And that's why in this particular case, the Talmud learns out how to exclude him. V'kosav. And he writes as follows. Deloi kashya, midei. So the Chasam Sofer is responding to this question. And he says, no. Even though I hear the question, he says, it's not a question at all, not a problem. De bevadai b'chol dinim hanoyagim beven noyach uv'chol inyanehem ein makom l'shiurin. Surely, in all laws applying and pertaining to the Noachide, and in all of their matters, there's no room for shiurim, for any of these measurements. They are halakha l'Moshe Sinai, an oral tradition given to Moses, only applying strictly to the Jews. Does not apply at all to the non-Jews. That's clear. But what about vows? And arachin are a particular type of a vow, where the Torah in the book of Leviticus speaks about if an individual says, my value is upon me, or so-and-so's value is upon me. Basically, there is a list of gender and age that everybody falls into that category, and if a person simply says that, so depending on the gender and on the age bracket, there's a specific amount of money that the Torah says clearly, and then that person is obligating himself to pay that money to the Beis HaMikdash. It's from 30 days old till age 5 to age 20, age 20 to age 60, and then 60 and on for the rest of their life, and it depends if the person is male or female. So it's a whole chart, if you will. That's called arachim. And then the person would have to donate that particular amount of money to the Holy Temple. So when it comes to vows, einam mi mitzvahs b'nei noyach, they're not part of the b'nei noyach mitzvahs. None of the 7 are vows. I mean, if you want to stretch it a little bit, is the ben noyach allowed to be deceitful? Is he allowed to lie? So that's a whole discussion. That's a form of stealing. It's not it's not directly monetary stealing, but it's a form of stealing. But that's the whole discussion. Let's leave that. But when it comes to vows, that's not part of mitzvahs b'nei noyach. Ela Torah chidsha. But rather, what does the Torah tell us? And this is what the Talmud learns out from this verse. Ish. The Torah uses the word man twice. We know there's not an extra letter, let alone word, in the written Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. And yet, over here it says, ish, every man. It should have just said ish. That means every man. Ish. Why the extra word? Why the double expression? L'rabbis, to include ben noyach, a ben noyach in this case, that yes, they can make vows or donations just like a Jew. It's because of the special added word. Otherwise, of course, we wouldn't include a non-Jew. But because the Torah says ish, it's to tell you Jew as well as non-Jew. Im kain, if so, mistayim ki Yisrael. So then they should be just like Jews. Because the Torah says this extra word to include the non-Jew when it comes to vows, so then the assumption would be they're just like Jews. in this regard. Loi mi boy leman domar. Okay, now it's going to be a little bit technical language over here, Talmud language. It goes without saying, according to the opinion, dun mina umina dun, that judge from it and from it judge back, neider mi Yisrael, meaning you could learn out vow from the Jew, umina, and from it, meaning malahalon bismanoy v'shtei sayros hachanami came. Just like by the Jew, adulthood is a certain age, 13, and he has the 2 pubic hairs. So too here, by the non-Jew. So therefore, I need the Torah to come and teach me that you don't have this 1 year business by the non-Jew, because we've just included him in vows. And therefore, I would assume include him all the way. And there's this special rule that the year prior to adulthood, it might be binding what he said. So therefore, I need a special teaching to tell me not for the non-Jew. So not only according to that opinion, but even if you're going to follow the other Talmudic opinion, not the one we just said, the judge from it and from it judge, but rather each thing in its own right, don't make such a connection. Hainu, meaning that means that if in the same verse it would have said Jew and non-Jew, it would have said so explicitly, and then we would compare the non-Jew to the Jew, but it doesn't say non-Jew in this verse. Who mentioned the non-Jew at all? Doesn't say anything about the non-Jew. Ela ish ksiv. It says ish. It uses the extra word ish, which means man. V'ukmei meirebuye oid ish acher hainu nachri. K'moi ha'isha Yisraeli. So we're learning out, which is one of the forms of how we derive law from the very cryptic, very exact written law from the Chumash, the Bible. So it's called a ribui, because there's an extra word. We're deriving from that word that the non-Jew is just like the Jew. But it doesn't say non-Jew in the verse, but it teaches it to us by using this extra word. And it's specifically when he has the 2 hairs in his proper time, in his adulthood. So then over there the Talmud excludes that if he's within the year beforehand, it doesn't count. But this is all with regards to vows, because the Torah includes the non-Jew with the word ish. Therefore, the Talmud tells you, but don't think that he's exactly like the Jew. That special rule of the year prior to turning 13, that his word may be valid and may be binding, that only applies to the Jew. That's why the Talmud has to tell it to us, because the Torah included the non-Jew in vows. We're on the top line of the left-hand column. But as far as all the other laws and acquisitions, civil law, of how to buy and sell, all those things, loy nitan lahem shiurin, measurements of any sort were not given to the non-Jew. Once they reach the age of understanding, of intellectual maturity, that if you explain something to him and they can grasp it, they're intellectual enough, that's called an adult. So in a sense, it's much more vague than by the Jew. Because as I mentioned before, by the Jew, it's pretty clear cut. I mean, not as clear as people think. They're saying, 13 years old, bar mitzvah. Okay, not just that, but once the person has the 2 hairs and age 13, that's it. We don't test his intelligence. Whereas by the non-Jew, If the guy happens to be a brilliant person, you can have a relatively very young child that would be an adult. And on the other hand, you can have someone who's really, really unintelligent and he just doesn't understand things. And he could be 20 years old and he's still a child, perhaps. So it's really vague by the non-Jew because shiurim were not given to the non-Jews. Next paragraph. Top of the left-hand column. Vida, and you should know. Dema shehiksha harav mitzvahs Hashem al divrei hagoyin noida b'Yehuda. So there's a certain author who asked a question on another one of the great geniuses. He actually lived also around the same time, about 200 years ago, the Noida b'Yehuda. B'mashe mefaresh, in that which he explains, the azhara dechol ben nechar lo yochal boy. We're going back now to what we started off in the beginning of this topic. Just to remind you, we quoted the Rambam, Maimonides, in the laws of Passover, where he says that it's forbidden for the Jew to feed the non-Jew from the Paschal offering. So the question is, who's the prohibition on? Is it on the feeder or on the eater? And how much? So if it's the Jew, the feeder, well then of course we know the measurement. Same amount that he himself must eat in order to fulfill the mitzvah. And today that's the amount of matzah one must eat. So that's the amount of meat for the Paschal offering you have to eat, which is called a kezayis. We discussed that. So if it's from his perspective, so then that's the amount he's not allowed to feed to the non-Jew. And if he gives him less than that amount, then he didn't really transgress. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of the eater of the non-Jew, well, if you're saying that there's no measurements, so then it could be the slightest amount. As long as it's a tiny, tiny piece of meat of the Paschal offering, he's not allowed to eat it, so you can't give it to him. And there, the Rambam says, a kezayis. He says, one who feeds a kezayis of the Paschal offering to a foreigner, to a non-Jew, is transgressing a negative commandment. And he does not get lashes, biblical lashes. So that was the beginning of this whole discussion. So now we say like this. The Noida b'Yehuda explains that which the Torah says, the prohibition of kol ben nechar lo yochal boy, that no foreigner, no non-Jew may eat from it, from the Paschal offering. Koi al ha-maichil is referring to the feeder, the Jew who's giving it. V'im kain, and if so, eich nimnis b'minyan ha-mitzvahs v'chulu. So how then is it counted in the 613 commandments, in the biblical commandments? Chaniz kerle'el b'dibur maschil u'matzasi, as we mentioned earlier. So he says like this. Hine ata ra'isi. Now, I happen to see, I saw now, shehagoin mar berei derav noida b'Yehuda b'sefer derish l'tzion derush shmini b'agol di b'maskal omnam nirali, that the son of the Noida b'Yehuda, in a book that he wrote, and he gives us the exact name and where it is there, the son of the Noida b'Yehuda says as follows. Hikshakein. He asks this question. Shaharei, kol moinei ha-mitzvahs, all those that enumerate and make the list of the 613 commandments, Harambam, V'smag, V'hara b'sefer HaChinuch, these are the main ones that took upon themselves to list the 613 commandments. None of them, referring to all three of them, none of them count this commandment of an outsider being forbidden from eating from the Korban Pesach as one of the 613. Ulefi divrei Adoni Avi Meiri v'Rabbi Hagoin. So the Noda Behuda's son says, and according to the words of my great father, Lo Yisyaches Lav Zeh Ki Im Al Ben Noyach V'Lo Yala Yisrael. This prohibition doesn't go to the Jew. It's not a prohibition on the Jew. It's on the Ben Noyach. He's not allowed to eat from the Paschal offering. V'Lo Yala Yisrael. And therefore, don't count it as one of the 613. 613 are the laws for the Jew. It's not one of the 613 commandments. The 613 are only for the Jews. But this mitzvah of the non-Jew being forbidden to eat from the offering is not counted in the list, in the count of the mitzvahs. Just like you don't count the, so to say, prohibition or the commandment of day and night should never cease. After the great flood, Noach, in Genesis, so then part of the covenant that God makes with Noach, with mankind, with creation, is, the verse states, day and night shall never rest, never cease. There's always going to be day and night. Okay? If you look at the words literally, it can sound like a commandment. So why don't we count that as one of the 613 commandments for the Jews? It's written in our Torah, it says, day and night shall not cease. Because that's a commandment to day and night, to the solar system, to the moon, to nature. God is telling us that He is guaranteeing that. It's not a commandment. Interesting comparison that he's making. So even though it does say it clearly that kol ben nechar lo yoichal boy, no non-Jew may eat from it. So it sounds like it's a commandment. Yeah, but it's not a commandment to the Jew. The kosav liyashev. So he writes there in order to answer Dema shechashvu lavd ben nechar lo yoichal boy. So those that did count it as one of the mitzvahs, who, the reason being, because this prohibition includes the Gam Yisrael Mumar la'akum lo yochal Pesach. It includes the Jew that became an adulterer, an idolater. He categorically left the Jewish faith. He converted out, so to say. That is called a mumar or a mishumad. So he too may not eat from the Paschal offering. As it is explicit in the Rambam, in that same chapter, the 9th chapter of the laws of the Paschal offering, of Sefer HaMitzvahs, and in the Rambam's shorter version, the book of mitzvahs, where he lists all 613, Lavin Kuf Chav Ches, negative prohibition number 128. So he does list that, because that is a commandment for a Jew. This is a Jew who has completely left Judaism. Not only that he is not observant, but he actually took on a forbidden religion or some type of idolatry. So that is called a Ben Nechar as well. So because of that, it's counted, but not because of the Ben Noyach, the Nachri, not because the person was born a non-Jew. That's his prohibition, but it's not one of the 613. But it is one of the 613 not to feed it to this mumar. V'im kain, and if so, Shapir azhara zoy misecheses gam liyisro. So then it works out very nicely, yes, that this prohibition does apply to a Jew as well. Vav shumumar la'akum. So now he's asking, wait a second. If he's a mumar for idolatry, that means he's lost his Judaism. That's the whole point. He's called a nachri. So what do you mean that it's counted as one of the 613 because we're talking about a Jew? You just said he left. Mikol makoim. Nonetheless, af shechato Yisraelahu v'shem Yisrael nikra alav liyes nechshav azarasa b'minyan tarag mitzvos. The Talmud makes a very, very powerful statement, and that is that even though he has sinned, he is still a Jew. A Jew is always a Jew, no matter what. If someone is born as a Jew, he is and he remains a Jew. Even if he becomes a mumar for avodah zarah. And although legally, as far as many laws are concerned, we consider him, we treat him kigoy, as a non-Jew, until he repents. However, as far as the prohibition is concerned of feeding him from Paschal offering, yes, he's not allowed to eat it from Paschal offering. He's like a non-Jew. But he's a Jew. So therefore, it counts as one of the mitzvahs, one of the prohibitions for the Jews. A proof to the words of my father, of the Noida B'Yehuda. From the Rambam, where we just quoted, in a Sefer HaMitzvahs, prohibition, mitzvah number 128. Kosav, Rambam writes, Sheiziranu, that Hashem has warned us, Me'achol Pesach liYisrael mumar la'akum, from feeding, from the Paschal offering, to a Yisrael, a Jew, who is a mumar for idolatry. Ad kan l'shenei. V'lama shava ko'azar leven noyach. Why did the Rambam leave out the prohibition of feeding it to a ben noyach? He mentions we're not allowed to feed it to a Jew that is a mumar. So why doesn't he mention that we're not allowed to feed it to the non-Jew, the ben noyach? Ella, rather, vadai, surely, tazhara zohi al ha'oichel atzmoi, v'loy al ha'machil, that this prohibition is on the eater, not on the feeder. But the prohibition about the non-Jew, you can't count it as one of the 613 because it's a prohibition on the non-Jew. So it's not one of the 613 for the Jew. If anything, it's got to be one of the 7, as we discussed a while ago, or make it an 8th. And if just quickly to remind you, if you recall, what were some of the answers that we gave? Why isn't there an 8th mitzvah b'nei noyach that the non-Jew can't eat from the Paschal offering? So one answer that we gave was that all the 7 apply in all times and all places. If you take each one of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei noyach, every one of them is applicable all the time. Whereas the Paschal offering, A, it's only once a year, and B, it's only when you have a holy temple and we have the Paschal offering. So therefore, even though it does apply to the ben noyach, it is a commandment that the ben noyach may not eat of this offering, but it doesn't count as the number of the mitzvahs b'nei noyach. So that's why it's not listed, because it's not a commandment for the Jew. It's a commandment for the ben noyach. Ulekach, loy nakat el Yisrael mumar la'akum at kanashoynoi. And for this reason, the Rambam only speaks about the Jew who is a mumar for akum, for idolatry. Up to here is what the son of the Noda B'Yehuda explained. And now says the S'dei Chemed. V'loi nisyashva daiti ho'aniya. And my impoverished mind has not been satisfied, has not been calmed. I don't understand. Mikol masha pikpakti l'mayla, everything that I was asking and wondering and hesitant above, all this, l'shita sagoin tzlach, according to the approach of the tzlach on the Rambam, v'ma'ayin yivchar, and whoever wants to take a look, your choice. You may delve into it and make your conclusion. V'roisi sha'agoin beis Yitzchak, yishmeim tshmim v'chaskim, b'chelik or Chaim simin chavtes oisches, hei v'shita sagoin tzlach, u'mar berei b'doirish l'tzion hanal. And I see that there is actually someone who was living at the time, the Beis Yitzchak. He brings down both the tzlach as well as the Noda B'Yehuda son. And he is not calmed with his great holy words. In other words, he also didn't really accept it. V'kosav, and he wrote, this Beis Yitzchak wrote, shebarur, that it's clear, shoemes k'meshikosav maran kesef mishnah, that the truth is like the Kesef Mishnah, the commentary on the Rambam wrote, which we quoted him earlier. Shahazhara hi ala maichil v'lo ala oichel, that this prohibition, the warning is on the feeder, the Jew, and not on the eater, the Ben Noach. V'ayin shom b'deirish l'tzion b'veis Yitzchak ma'id shokol v'toru, and take a look in these books, the son of the Noda B'Yehuda and the Beis Yitzchak, in their whole give and take. Al mashakasav Rabbeinu achinuch, and that which the Sefer Achinuch wrote, she'enoi loike hamaychil, that the Jew is feeding him does not get the biblical lashes, the 39 lashes, even though he's saying that the prohibition is on the feeder. Lefi she'en boi maise. The reason he doesn't get it is this goes into another one of the many rules. When it comes to transgressing a negative commandment for the Jew, as a rule, with exceptions, the punishment for a Jew who transgresses one of the negative commandments of the 613 is 39 lashes. That's what the Torah says clearly. Now, there are exceptions. There's rules. First of all, he has to have done it on purpose, not accidentally. And there has to be a proper warning right before he commits the sin to warn him. But if you have all that in place, he would get lashes. But there are exceptions. There are 365 negative prohibitions. Out of the 613, 248 positive, 365 negative. Out of those, 307 are, 207, 207 out of the 365 are punished by giving lashes. What happened to the rest? 207 out of 365. Well, there's a bunch of rules. One of the rules is that the only time a Jew can get 39 lashes for transgressing is if it is a lav, it's a negative commandment, a prohibition, which has an act to it, physical act. But if the way the one transgresses is by thought or by speech or by being passive or something like that, doesn't apply. So that knocks off a whole bunch. So you're saying that in this case, by feeding it to the non-Jew, by giving the Paschal offering meat to the Ben Noyach, that is the prohibition on the Jew. He is transgressing. The reason he doesn't get lashes, as the Rambam says, is because it doesn't have an action to it. He's not eating. Because it's possible you can have a case where he shoves it into his mouth. He takes the piece of meat and he just forces it into his mouth. Now, there is a very famous commentary on the Sefer HaChinuch, and it's called the Minchas Chinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch, like the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvahs and like the Smag, Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, he lists the 613. He devotes a paragraph, sometimes short, sometimes very long, but a paragraph to explain the mitzvah. And the way the Sefer Chinuch did it was he goes in chronological order of how it appears in the Chumash. Okay? He starts from the beginning of the Chumash, and any one of the 613 commandments, he writes down, this is this and this commandment, and he just lists all 613, and it's a whole book called Sefer HaChinuch. Sometime later came a great genius, and on each one of these mitzvahs, each one of these paragraphs, he goes into deep depth and into a whole Talmudic discussion and explains, and in this case, on this mitzvah, the Minchas Chinuch, says the S'dei Chemed here, goes on with very great length, as he often does, and it's not according to what we hold, says the S'dei Chemed, and therefore I'm just going to be brief, and I'm not going to quote all of that and address it. Last paragraph on the left-hand column. Af gam zois lemoidoi ani tzarich. However, I also have to make the following declaration. I have to inform you of the following, says the S'dei Chemed. Ki achar zman, sometime later, after a while, matzasi b'shalos tshuvas bris Yankiv la'goin baruch Mordechai Lifshitz b'chelok archaim b'simen chav b'dibur maschil anius daiti. A particular responsa from a rabbi. He says, I found that he writes as follows: Shekosav, the Medivri HaTosfos b'Sanhedrin daf Tesnun, that from the words of the commentary of Tosfos in the Tractate of Sanhedrin on page 59, Dibur Damaschil v'ha priya urevia, the opening words of Tosfos. Tema, Tosfos asks, question, Minolon, from where do we know that the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply to have children was not said to the Noachites? If you're going to say because it's not part of the 7, we have the tradition of what the 7 are, and one of the 7 is not to have children, and not one of the 7 is to have children. I have to be careful how I said that sentence. So says Tosfos, but we already say above, that positive commandments are not included. Meaning, when we speak about Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noyach, with the exception of the one to establish courts, they're all negative. But as far as positive, there could be a whole long list, much more than 7. And they are commandments, and they are binding, and they are divine commandments for B'nai Noyach. 7, because we're saying those are the ones which are passive. Don't. V'yesh loymar, The sheval tasa namihu. So an interesting answer Tosfos gives now. That actually having children, which sounds like it's proactive, like it's a positive commandment, so Tosfos wants to suggest that it's also passive. It's part of shev val tasa. Sit and don't do. Be passive. Why? It's also passive. The misha mitzuva al priya revia, because whoever is commanded to have children, mitzuva shelo lahashchis zera, at kan lashonai, is commanded not to destroy or to spill his seed, not to spill any semen. Now, for a Jew, it's a very big prohibition. It's an extremely big sin to spill seed. In other words, that it should not go into the woman. So it goes along with having children. And therefore, by the Bnei Noach, Tosfos wants to suggest that they are commanded to have children. And the reason why it's not mentioned is because, and it is actually a passive mitzvah, and therefore it should be one of the 7, just like the other 7 are passive. What's passive about it? Because whoever is obligated to have children is forbidden from spilling seed. All right, that's the quote of the Tosfos. Nitchu divrei hatzlach. So this actually rejects the words of the tzlach that we were dealing with. So like, S'dei Chemed, I guess, is sort of happy because he doesn't agree with the tzlach. What do we mean? Diledvar Rav, according to the tzlach, akate tikshe, you could still ask, minayin de pri revia loy nemer livnei noach. How do we know that the commandment of having children was not said to the Noachites? That which it's not listed explicitly as one of the 7. Lema, getting back to what we mentioned before, when we spoke about why the Paschal offering, if it is for the Ben Noach, if it's a commandment that he's not allowed to eat from it, why isn't it one of the 7? So I reminded you that it's because the 7 have to apply all the time, everywhere. Whereas this one is only once a year, and it's only when we have a temple. Similarly, the mitzvah of having children is not a constant mitzvah. It's not all the time. It's not an obligation every moment. Because the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply, if he already brought into this world, if he fathered a son and a daughter, he has fulfilled his biblical obligation, and he need not have any more children biblically. That's how it is for the Jew. So therefore, it's unlike the other mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach are mitzvahs that you have to keep on keeping. Don't kill. Well, I didn't kill for 50 years, so maybe now I could. No, don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't worship anything else. No blasphemy. Don't eat a limb off of a live animal. All of those apply no matter how good you were and how long you kept them. They're forever, an entire lifetime. And pru urvu, having children, is not like that, because it's a commandment where you could fulfill, and once you fulfilled it, you no longer are obligated. So it doesn't fall into the category of the definition of these 7. Lachein loy chashiv. Therefore, it's not included. But really, you can say that it is a commandment for Bnei Noach to have children. V'loy dami le'inach k'mei shekasav gabi b'neichar lo yechal boy. So it's not like the other ones, just like he wrote with regards to the prohibition of a ben noach eating from the paschal offering. Same idea. V'oid, furthermore, l'chayra kashe, apparently it's difficult. Ha'deparich ha'gemara, that which the Talmud asks, gabi nochri sheshavas, with regards to a non-Jew that kept Shabbos. A ben noach, a nochri, sheshavas, he rested on Shabbos. V'chein gabi nochri shoyesik b'teira, and likewise, a non-Jew who's involved in Torah study. Both of those are clearly forbidden. So same question. Let's count those in the Sheva mitzvahs. How come they don't count? Can't kill, can't steal, etc., etc., etc. So why don't we say can't keep Shabbos and can't be oisek involved in Torah study? The Gabi b'nei Yisrael muzharin aleihem. Kamar the Sheva mitzvahs elu ben noach muzhar aleihim ki Yisrael. So he wants to suggest that the 7 mitzvahs b'nei noach are those mitzvahs that a Jew has to keep as well. So out of all the mitzvahs for a Jew, here are 7 which the non-Jew as well has to keep. But when it comes to Shabbos, it's the opposite. The Jew has to keep Shabbos, the non-Jew is not allowed to. When it comes to Torah study, the Jew has to study Torah, the non-Jew is not allowed to. So it doesn't count as one of the 7, because all 7 are 7 mitzvahs out of the 613, which apply to the Jew, and they do as well apply to the non-Jew. But these, the Gabi Yisrael Shari, that for the Jew it's permitted. The Jew has a commandment to refrain from labor on the Sabbath. The Jew is commanded to study Torah. And for the Bnei Noach, you don't count this forbidden, the prohibition. Therefore, if a Ben Noach kept Shabbos, quote unquote, even on a Monday, got the wrong day, but he kept Shabbos. The Yisrael Shari, a Jew is allowed to do that. A Jew is allowed to refrain from doing work. For 24 hours, a Jew is allowed to say, I'm going to treat it like a regular Shabbos. I won't do any of those many, many labors that I'm not allowed to do on Shabbos. He's not transgressing. A non-Jew is not allowed to do that. Not only can the non-Jew not keep Shabbos on the right day, he can't keep Shabbos on the wrong day as well. So that's not listed, because it's different. The only ones we count, what makes it into the list of the 7, if it applies to the Jew as well and to the non-Jew. So we have to say that it doesn't make any sense in the eyes of the Talmud. To say this, that since there's no prohibition for the Jew, but rather he's actually commanded to. He has to keep Shabbos, he has to study Torah. Therefore, it's not counted for the Bnei Noach. The reason the Talmud won't accept that is because it's coming to teach us everything that the non-Jew, that the Ben Noach is commanded to keep. What is he commanded not to do? Therefore, it should count these as well. That if a non-Jew kept Shabbos, and if a non-Jew studied Torah. Shapir. It works out if you're going to take the approach and say, well, we don't count positive activities. Those are not part of the 7. The 7 are all negative. They're all passive. Then it makes sense that in the list of the 7, we're only mentioning those which the Ben Noach has commanded not to do. Medini, and what about the 7th one, which is to establish courts, which that's a positive one? Nami sheval tasehu. That's actually also passive. Even though it's a positive commandment, but it's also passive. Kedekas of Rashi, as Rashi explains. V'chashiv shiva dvarim shebenech muzar shaloi lasois. And therefore, the Talmud lists the 7 things that the Ben Noach is commanded not to do. That he needs to not transgress. He needs to be passive and not do. But with that which the Ben Noach is obligated to actively do, like a chashiv, is not listed, it's not mentioned. And that's why it doesn't mention. Im kain nitchu divrei tzlach. So if so, the words of the tzlach have just been rejected. The atu kevon dehi lav mitzvah tmidis ve'ena b'chol shah lo miboy l'machshavei gabi sheva mitzvahs. Just because it's not a constant mitzvah, it doesn't apply all the time, so should it not be listed in the 7 mitzvahs? Ad kan l'shoinai. Hare, so behold, the Gama going bris yankiv lo nizkar radaitoi. So I'm in good company, so to say, says the S'dei Chemed. That also this genius, the Bris Yaakov, his mind was also not calmed in Masha Yishev Hagoin Tzlach, in that which the Tzlach answered. Why the Korban Pesach is not listed in the Sheva Mitzvahs. He also doesn't agree with that. We're getting close to the end of this particular subject. As you could see, at the end of this column is going to be the next topic for the Bnei Noach. And at least the next paragraph is really continuation of what we're talking about. But we are pretty much out of time. So we're going to stop at this point. And until next time, wishing everybody the greatest success in studying, in promoting, and in keeping all of the 7 Noachide commandments, and making this world the perfect world that it's meant to be, with the advent of Mashiach, which is upon us, and we will merit the complete revelation of our righteous Mashiach and the complete and absolute and true redemption immediately now. Thank you.